Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everybody about our meeting format. Tonight's Planning Commission meeting is being held in person and online. Commissioners, Planning Department staff, and members of the public are attending in the Wheat Ridge City Hall and by way of Zoom platform. Members of the public who are not present and wish to make comments may participate virtually by joining through Zoom, either on a device or by calling in. A Zoom meeting link and dial-in information can be found on wheatridgespeaks.org. In addition to being online via Zoom, we are also broadcasting this meeting on Channel 8 and wheatridgespeaks.org. When it's time for public comment, those who wish to comment on our Zoom connection, use the raise your hand button. If you're dialing in, press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute your phone. If you plan to speak tonight, please keep background noise to a minimum. We appreciate your participation in tonight's meeting. We hope to create a friendly and respectful atmosphere for public dialogue, and we appreciate your help in the process. I would now like to call to order the City of Wheat Ridge Planning Commission for March 6, 2025. May I please get a roll call of members?
Cody Hedges.
Here.
Krista Hollab.
Here.
Christine Disney.
Here.
Daniel Gravy.
Here.
Patrick Quinn.
Here.
Michael Moore.
Here.
Sierra Maquiones.
Here.
And Susan Wood is absent tonight.
The next order on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand and join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag. The next item is approving the order of tonight's agenda. Does anybody have any changes? Seeing none, the agenda will stand as published. Next, we'll vote to approve the minutes from the last meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Is there a motion to approve the minutes from February 20th, 2025?
So moved, Madam Chair.
May I have a second?
Second.
Commissioners, please vote. All right.
Motion approved. 6-2. Sorry, 6-0 with 0.
I should abstain.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Sorry.
I'll make note of that. So 4-0 with 3 abstaining.
All right, thank you. We do not have any cases to be heard tonight. This is a study session, and we'll have a presentation about the city plan. May I please have the presentation?
Yes, you may. I'm going to do it from here since that means I can see you guys better and speak right to you. And Tammy, it already automatically did it. Thank you. Okay, let me get to presentation mode. All right, I'm Ella Stevie. I'm a senior planner, and I am joined by my colleagues from our consultant CZB online. Eric, Amy, and Matt Ingalls are going to join us online, and they'll jump in for a part of the presentation in a few minutes. So thank you for having us back. We're excited to be here with you to talk about the city plan again. And I will just jump right in. So this evening, we're going to do a brief project overview. It's been since October, early October, that we were here last. So I want to give a brief overview of what we heard since then and just kind of a refresher on where we've been so far, including what we've heard. Then we're going to have a discussion about planning for character in Wheat Ridge. Then we'll move on to a section that we're calling Imagining Our Future, and that's a look at our focus areas. We'll have a short discussion after that section, and then we'll talk a little bit about implementation and what to expect after the plan is adopted, and we'll stop and talk about that as well. And then I'll wrap up with some brief next steps. So let's start with this project overview. Just as a reminder, we are working on a new comprehensive plan for Wheat Ridge called the City Plan. So the City Plan should articulate the community's vision and shared values. It should identify priorities for the future. It should provide a framework for decisions for years to come, and it should guide actions and investments. So this is our fourth phase of engagement that we're in right now. So we're most of the way through the process at this point. The next time we meet, you all will have a draft plan in hand. So what we've heard so far in phase 1, which was last spring, we saw emerging consensus from the community that we know what's working, and we also know what we want for a stronger future. Then in phase 2, which was last summer, the community confirmed the core values, the principles, and the priorities that we presented. Then in phase 3, which was last fall, the community shared how you like to get around and how you'd like to see the city manage new development. So in phase 3, we had over 170 attendees at our open house, and we got over 230 responses online. As part of phase 3, we also went to the Wheat Ridge High School. So community engagement specialist Ashley Holland and I worked with 6 classes and heard from over 100 students. We got a lot of great information, and we also confirmed that high school students want a lot of the same things that, that adults want. They want things like places to hang out with friends and an easier time getting around without a car. I personally also learned or confirmed how wonderfully exhausting it is to be a teacher. I don't think I've ever been so tired as I was at the end of the day, but it gave me renewed respect for teachers. And it was really, I was so glad we went. It was just so great to get to learn from a different demographic. And it felt like the high school students really appreciated being listened to by their government. You know, these are kids who can't even vote yet, but we were able to give them a voice in the future of their city. So that was part of phase 3. And then in our last study session here, phase 3, we also dived a bit deeper into that phase 3 content. So we heard about the place type framework, and we also discussed how we can facilitate peaceful coexistence with new development and existing neighborhoods. And we also talked about the proposed mobility network. So this map on the left shows how people shared they want to get around Wheat Ridge. And then we'll use that input to update the proposed mobility framework that you can see on the right to make sure it responds to how people want to travel around the city. Then we asked people to choose the 3 most important items that must be addressed when new development is proposed. And this is what we heard. So parking and traffic generally got a lot of responses, followed by building height, landscape and streetscape, and physical and visual separation. There's a little bit more about all of this and what we heard and some summarized input of the specific feedback on our project website right now. So now I want to hand it over to CZB, who's going to talk about kind of some content for the city plan that we developed since then based on that feedback. So are you guys, you should be panelists. I will turn my mic off and let you take over.
I don't think we can hear you. Give me 1 second.
If that workaround doesn't work, then Eric, if you can hear me, if you're able to pull up the presentation on your screen, we're realizing that we can't, if I'm sharing my screen beam, we can't hear you. So I'm gonna, I think we're gonna end that and see if you can pull up the presentation.
Okay. Do we have audio?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And you can see slides? Ella, can you see slides?
I can't, but commission members can. So we're good. You can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. Again, my name is Eric Amy from CZB, joined by my colleague Matt Ingalls from CZB. I think all of you have met us in our various combinations or some of our combinations before. Again, nice to be back with you. As Ella said, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the key elements of this phase 4 engagement, and that is planning for character in Wheat Ridge. So character can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, and what we are, not to minimize any other definitions or ways of thinking about it, but what we're really going to talk about tonight and what the city plan is going to focus on is physical character. This is a comp plan after all. Comprehensive plans inform development efforts, both private development and public capital projects. And so these things that get built that are tangible, real pieces of our environment in our communities, this is what we're talking about in terms of character. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind as we're talking about these items tonight. When we talk about character and we talk about the city plan, what is it that we're trying to achieve? We are, if you recall, we talked about the place types framework last time we saw you. We're not going to get into that tonight in any detail, but we did go over that. You might remember that map with all the colors on it, all the different kinds of places in Wheat Ridge. Well, we want to talk about the evolution of these places and the recognition that they will change incrementally. Development is not a yes/no question. It's inevitable that change will happen. We want that change to be well managed. We want it to be incremental so that the individual areas of Wheat Ridge that have their own distinct look and feel will more or less maintain that even as they become better versions of themselves into the future. So that's one. The second is peaceful coexistence. Ella talked a little bit about that just a minute ago, about what we learned in the last phase of engagement as we asked about peaceful coexistence and what kinds of elements of development are most important in people's minds to be well regulated and controlled. So to ensure that new development peacefully coexists with what we already have, new development in or near existing neighborhoods, that it's a good fit. So that's number two. Number three is the improved connectivity and access that is represented in the mobility framework and the vision for a future in Wheat Ridge where it's easier to get around town on foot, by bike especially. Not only, but especially those two. And finally, making great places. So continuing to create and sustain places in Wheat Ridge that people really want to be, that they really want to spend time, gather, hang out. And a lot of that's the spaces between the buildings. So that we're going to talk about that as well. The tools that the city of Wheat Ridge or any local government really has to help achieve these outcomes, we are roughly placing into these four categories for the purposes of our conversation and the structure of how we'll deal with this in the city plan. And none of these tools we're not inventing new tools here. These are not novelties. These are things that the city of Wheat Ridge really does already in different ways, shapes, and forms. So these tool categories are from left to right. Use tools. So how and for what are we using the properties and buildings? And that's generally regulated in the zoning code. Form tools, which really speak to the physical characteristics of the built environment, size, shape, and placement of buildings, parking requirements, landscaping, etc. These are not all, these are just some examples. What we're calling going places tools is the third category. And going places is really focused on mobility, and it's really about getting from here to there. It's really about maximizing ease of travel. And that comes in the form of things like infrastructure and treatments on our streets and sidewalks. Staying places tools also manifests in infrastructure and treatments on our streets and sidewalks. But instead of emphasizing the importance and ease of travel of just getting from here to there, it's really about creating places where people want to stay, where they want to linger, where they want to spend time. So That's our four groups: our use tools, our form tools, our going places tools, and our staying places tools. And we'll just quickly run through a few examples of these. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just to give a flavor of the kinds of things that we're talking about. So these use tools or use categories that can be regulated in development regulations, most notably zoning, things like residential uses, commercial and retail uses, civic and institutional uses. Those are things like schools, churches, government buildings, etc., and industrial uses as well. Our form tools, some examples of these include height and bulk plane. So height is pretty self-explanatory, how tall buildings can be, and bulk plane is how that height steps back as it goes upward. Screening and landscaping, that's something that can be regulated as well. How are we creating the right kinds of buffers and transitions between different properties or different kinds of properties? Setbacks, how far are buildings from each other and from property lines? And again, parking requirements, which play a big role in the physical attributes of any property that is built. Our going places tools. These are just some examples. We have kind of one for each different kind of mode of travel. So for pedestrians, obviously we have sidewalks. In this case, we have a detached sidewalk. You could have an attached sidewalk or other kinds of pedestrian infrastructure. Right below that, we are obviously going to make sure to think about vehicular travel. This happens to be an example of a 2 to 3 travel lane cross section. It's a common one in Wheat Ridge. It's not the only one. There are many different kinds of street widths and lane configurations, obviously. Moving over to the right, our bike lanes, which can come in different forms, all the way from shared lane markings where cyclists are moving with the flow of vehicular traffic in the same lanes, all the way up to very heavily protected bike lanes that are separated from the flow of vehicular traffic. And then below that is an example of a dedicated bus lane. We want to make sure we're also thinking about our transit needs. And so these are examples of tools. All of these modes of travel have a variety of tools based on the context and what we're trying to achieve. So these are, again, just some of those. And our last toolkit here are staying places tools. The tools we want to deploy when we're really trying to make a great place where people want to spend time. So some of the ways that we do that, again, not all the ways, but some are sidewalk requirements. So in places where you really want to create a attractive and inviting environment, you'll treat your sidewalks different from how you will treat them in other locations and other contexts. They might be wider, for example. Frontage improvements is right below that. So as many of you know, because you know Wheat Ridge so well, you know that it's a mid-20th century community. It was developed at that time, very auto-centric. And so there's a lot of front yard parking. And that's going to continue to be the case in Wheat Ridge's future for quite some time. But we can still improve the environment, we can improve the pedestrian experience and the sense of place through some thoughtful and strategic improvements to the frontages of properties where we do have that front yard parking. Another one is lighting and street furniture standards. So things like benches, things like pedestrian scale lighting, other things that make the environment a place where people want to be. And then finally, street trees and landscaping requirements. Street trees, obviously, it's almost a no-brainer what a difference they can make in shaping an environment where people want to be. And just generally landscaping requirements as well, make it more pleasant, make it more attractive. We want to take a moment here and talk about our going places tools and our staying places tools, because while they tend to sort of be used in the same kinds of spaces, it's difficult to kind of get all of them all the time in every location. So we have to consider trade-offs. There are times, for example, when you might ask yourself the question, well, is this a location where we really want to prioritize bike lanes because we want to make sure that cyclists can get through this particular location safely and easily? Or there may be times where you say, that's actually not our highest priority. What we want is to create an environment where people want to stay. They're not trying to move through it, they're trying to stay. And so a bike lane may be given up in lieu of something else that would help us better achieve that goal. One clear example would be to potentially not have a bike lane, but have on-street parking instead. Why on-street parking? For a couple of reasons. One, because it supports the businesses and perhaps in a business district that we're talking about. Also, it's a traffic calming measure. So when we're really trying to get traffic to slow down, that's something that we could do instead of the bike lane. What we have here on this slide are kind of an example of that. And these are just top and bottom, two hypothetical 66-foot standard right-of-ways, and just two examples of how we might use this right-of-way and the elements that we might include depending on whether we were emphasizing going places tools or staying places tools. So for example, above, clearly you've got the travel lanes for cars. We have buffered bike lanes for cyclists. Again, we're thinking about efficiency of travel. We're thinking about safety. And we have 8-foot sidewalks. And you'll notice that, for example, our street trees are a bit pushed back from the curb. So this is really, you can think of this as a thoroughfare. This is a place to move through. It's about getting people, bikes, vehicles through a place easily and safely. Contrast that with the example at the bottom, where while we still have a street with vehicular travel lanes, we also have, as I referenced a minute ago, we have on-street parking there on the right. We have reclaimed some space on the pavement at left, just outside the curb, excuse me, where it's parklet or some reclaimed space for outdoor dining, something along those lines. Our street trees are very close. We have pedestrian scale lighting, and you can contrast that pedestrian scale lighting with the larger scale lighting that's meant more to light the roadway above. So these are just examples. There could be infinite permutations of the way that these things are mixed and matched in any particular right-of-way, depending on the goals that we're trying to achieve. But we're hoping that this helps to visualize the differences between the going places and the staying places. Ella, is there anything that you wanted to add for the Planning Commission before we move on?
I think it's just, I think we want to, it's kind of two sides of the same coin, but we want to also make sure that we're not creating like a false dichotomy. These are both great places and cities need both kinds of places. And when we're thinking about them, we know from meetings we've had previously that we want to work towards a more complete multimodal network. And so to implement most of that, we would expect to work towards that by prioritizing those going places tools and then incorporating the staying places tools as appropriate. In specific locations, though, that we're going to talk about on the next slide, we want to think about doing that a little bit differently.
Right.
Eric, I can just front load my comments and then let you take over. So in these specific locations, we would want to think about doing that the opposite way, where we're actually prioritizing the staying places tools and then applying the going places tools as possible. All right, Eric, I'll mute myself. It's all you.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good explanation, Ella. And it's fair to ask the question, when you're looking at these potential options, well, okay, how do we really know? How do we make that determination about when it's time to emphasize the staying places tools? So we think that it's important for the city plan to have something to say about that. And inside the team, we spent some time thinking about where I guess the best examples or the most critical locations would be to emphasize the use of those staying places tools so that the city plan can provide some guidance. And we're testing this through this phase of public engagement. So we're asking the public what they think about these and whether we have missed any. Did we get it right? Did we get it wrong? And we would be certainly open to your thoughts on this as well. I think now is a good time to. And so just before we go to kind of questions and discussion, again, these red blobs that you see on this map are locations that we thought would be the most important for emphasizing staying places tools. They may not be the only ones. There may be others that sort of are just as important as these. There may be others that fall into some kind of secondary importance category. We're not 100% sure. But this is our best guess at the moment based on everything that we think we know about Wheat Ridge. We will see what the public says. We talked about this with council the other night as well, and they may have additional feedback, but we would be happy to get your feedback on these and whether these are the right ones or whether we're missing some as well. And I think with that question and that prompt, it's also a good time just to take a break because we've been talking for a little while and open the floor for any questions that commissioners might have.
Commissioners, does anybody have questions at this point? I have a question, and I just am asking this out of clarification. I think it's obvious, but in looking at the map where on page 18, where you're talking about imagining our future and the focus areas also on the map on page 17, it seems like it's weighted towards the east side of town, the middle of town, but not out west. I'm going to assume Applewood and Clear Creek aren't on here because they're new development and they're having amenities and things built as we speak. Is that correct?
Yes, so we do have Clear Creek on the gateways and gathering locations, kind of thinking about that new, the dining district part of that as a place that would be one of those kind of staying places. For the focus areas, we were trying to use this as an exercise to illustrate some of the more like low-hanging fruit too. And just because of, places like Clear Creek, those are like the big investments, the big full redevelopments. And so we just thought there was a little less value add for us to take the time to illustrate those places. So I'll talk about the focus areas a little bit next, but I want to emphasize that isn't intended to drive public investment at all. Those are really examples to illustrate some different solutions to issues that are faced all over the city, including in the areas that aren't showing up on there.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Cody?
I wasn't sure how to signal the first time. So I did want to point out that I don't know if I mentioned this at the steering committee. I get to cheat a little bit because I'm in the steering committee as well. But I love the fact that we went to the high school. I do think asking high schoolers what they think about the comp plan is important because A, it gets them interested in the city, and B, they are individuals who have a more restrictive form of transportation, and that until they turn 16, they can't drive, right? And so I think asking them those certain questions are beneficial. In the steering committee, I did mention that safety over mobility paradigm that I kind of wanted to keep in mind. And then one thing that came to mind here as we were looking at this, there was that list on page 10, I think, of 8 on page 8. And there was a segment of parking and traffic, and I just want to make sure I point out, at least the way I looked at that when I was going through these surveys as well, is there wasn't a bike ped individual section. So parking and traffic isn't, to me, just about vehicles. Parking and traffic is about bikes, peds, pedestrians, and vehicles. So it's sometimes a balance, but it's also like a balance with that safety. And so I just want to make sure I kind of pointed that out, that we don't get parking and traffic lost in just thinking about vehicles when we're going through the comp plan.
Yes, that is a good point. And we did, I can't remember what this question text was specifically, but I know when we were writing it and thinking about it, we were including bike parking in that, for example. It's kind of a catch-all for moving and storing everyone, not just vehicles.
Commissioner Gravy.
Thank you. I hope this is the appropriate time for a couple of these questions. If not, we can put them off. But the couple of thoughts I had on the content that we've looked over thus far, there was one mention of dedicated bus lane as a consideration. I don't know of any instances where that exists in this community now. I will say that it's an interesting concept because right now both in the city and county of Denver and from the State Department of Transportation, there's a lot of work on bus rapid transit projects that are oftentimes, not always, but including that design. And I really think it's going to, when these things get implemented, it's along a huge stretch of Colfax, Federal Boulevard, number of areas. I think that it will change the way a lot of people interact with transit. And I think, if for those of us who's visited other, cities or countries that have this type of transit network, it really is a game changer. And so I don't, it'd be interesting to see when those projects come to completion within the next 5 years, we'll say, how we might be looking at that as an option. The other mobility, consideration that I have, and this is coming from someone who's been a, bike commuter for decades at this point. The rise in e-bikes, and not even just e-bikes, but electric powered devices, is really, I think, when you look at the kind of the curve over the past, relatively short period of time, it's really had a pretty big impact on the use of trails, unfortunately, oftentimes sidewalks. And so I just wonder if, there's enough weight given to and whether or not this level of increase of these kind of devices and ways to get around it will continue to increase at this rate. I don't know, but if it does, it will, have a dramatic impact on the way we understand mobility without, vehicles, without automotive. And so, those are just random thoughts. And I don't know, just something to keep in mind in terms of, it's hard to think in the future. That's this whole exercise. I know you all are very good at it. A lot of us, myself included, not always so great at it. It's a difficult thing to do. But I think those are some kind of things that might be real visible in the next 5 to 10 years. And then the very last thing I wanted to say, sorry to just comment on the high school thing. Ella, if you indicated that they shared a lot of the concerns and they provided a lot of good input. And I'm just curious if they had any more critical input as far as challenges that they face in the community now, rather than just things that they, are kind of hoping for. Is there examples of things that they're kind of frustrated with or something? So.
I think the biggest one that we heard, and we did ask, how do you get to school and what's your experience with doing that? And as a couple of you have noted, before kids are 16, they're getting a ride or something else. And it's definitely sobering to hear from a 15-year-old who's walking in a ditch because where they need to go, they don't feel safe on the shoulder and there isn't a sidewalk. So I do think that was the biggest one. And I think I would say the kinds of places that the different people wanted to hang out. You get to see so many budding personalities and people with very niche interests. And I remember we had a great running list of what would you like to do on the weekend? I wish there was an owl sanctuary. I think it's interesting I think because teens aren't as easily mobile, they want all those niche things nearby. And so that was one piece where I was I don't think we can get that through the city plan. But I do think, I think that's where the kind of transportation piece comes in. If you can get to the owl sanctuary in Westminster, I don't know, I'm making that up. I don't remember that specifically, but I think that was a big one. We also asked people, how many of you think, if you're picturing yourself in your mid-20s, how many of you would come back to Wheat Ridge? And those numbers were pretty low, but there were holdouts who in every class who kept their hand proudly held high, even when they saw that no one else was. But I think that's typical. I think that would happen in any high school, in anywhere. No one wants, at that point. So I think those were some of the big ones that came up a lot. And I just want to speak to your earlier question or comment about the kind of the rise in e-bikes and other electric vehicles. We're really hoping that this plan helps us both both in, and I think I mentioned it at the beginning, but both in helping us plan for what's known and helping us respond to what's unknown. So when we're thinking about like these toolboxes, the city plan won't ultimately say, you need to apply these specific tools on this road. What it's going to have is like, here's this full suite, including things like bus-only lanes. We don't see those now in Wheat Ridge, but maybe in the future, in the next 15 years, there will be a case for that. So we want our city plan to be able to respond to that. I'm hoping that that toolkit approach will also provide a good decision-making framework to respond to things that come up. So we'll have a couple different options that we can tweak and modify and use as appropriate to respond to changing needs for when in 8-10 years, when this plan still applies, but it's a totally new landscape, we're hoping it will still help give us good guidance in those cases.
Commissioner Quinn?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I really like the graphics that you've put on here, everyone. This is great, and it really brings to light the going places and staying places on how you can use those for traffic calming. And so really the only the only comment I really kind of have is the staying places. You've got it on the map, the low-hanging fruit, a little more commercial, trendy kind of areas. Would that be a good place to for schools, parks, something of that nature where we want to kind of whoa up cars as well? In front of, like I said, I'm just off the top of my head, the high school and some of the parks, Crown Hill and stuff, to get everybody to slow down, because somebody's always saying, oh my God, everyone's doing, they're speeding in my neighborhood. And anyhow, that's it. And really good job on the graphics. It's amazing how much 1 foot will do on a lane width. And I'm like, holy cow, that's narrow. Thanks.
Yes, well, I have to pass all those thanks on to CZB. They did all the graphics. And I think you had a good point about like there are other places that need special attention other than what's showing up on that gateways and gathering locations map. Another map that will be part of the full city plan. We talked about it more in phase 3 so that we didn't come up in this packet, but we do have other known areas that need improvements, real safety improvements, and that whole stretch of 32nd along the high school is one of them. So I think that gateways and gathering locations those staying places tools can be ways to slow people down, but there are also a lot of other going places tools applied properly that would greatly improve safety, slow things down. So I think what you'll see in the final, plan is a different map that says these aren't necessarily gateways and gathering locations, but they need attention and they need updates to move people more safely, especially non-motorized people. All right, well then we will carry on. And then, well, actually, if that's working, Eric, would you mind moving us forward so that you're able to chime in too?
Sure.
Great, thank you. So if that's working, we'll just keep your presentation in this format. So we will move on now to our focus areas. So these are areas located within Wheat Ridge where the project team has illustrated how the tools that we just discussed could be applied to address issues that are common across Wheat Ridge. The illustrations in these areas are intended to be prototypes for other places in the city that are facing similar issues. So I'll walk through some specific details of each of them tonight, but they are included in their full glory and in your attachment 3 of your packet. So, Eric, if you could go to the next one. Thank you. Okay, so this first image shows what it might look like to see some of these tools applied along Wadsworth Boulevard. So this is a pretty typical commercial center with a multi-tenant plaza. As the major public investment along this stretch wraps up, which it will wrap up eventually, I promise, we anticipate that some private reinvestment may follow that. So there are a few tools that we call out here, and they're color coordinated by what set of tools they belong to. If you're a systems thinker, which you can see on the bottom left. So you can see new buildings with smaller setbacks from Wadsworth that create a more welcoming and pedestrian-friendly streetscape. Behind those buildings, much of the parking remains, but it's no longer right up against the street and that new multi-use trail. And it also has landscaping and other shade elements. Then along the street, there's lighting and street furniture standards that can improve safety and foster a sense of place along an otherwise pretty busy regional corridor. And similarly, street trees will help soften that corridor, and they'll also provide shade. So then we can move on to the next image. Okay, so this image shows 44th Avenue where it crosses over the creek. So this area is not currently slated to redevelop in the near term. However, if any of the properties adjacent to the trail or to city parks ever do redevelop, new development has really uniquely tremendous potential to prioritize publicly accessible trail-oriented design. So that includes buildings that face the trail and landscape designs that allow people to recreate and gather along this key amenity. Additionally, the existing bridge over 44th Avenue has been identified as one that will need to be replaced in the future due to flooding patterns. So this major investment provides a key opportunity to build a replacement that provides safe, comfortable access for bicyclists and pedestrians. So removing that right-of-way constraint on this bridge specifically also opens up some options for this whole section of 44th, which has been identified as a key gap in pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. A critical first step to any updates to that lane configuration is a traffic study. Once we know what that analysis yields, we can work on implementing appropriate improvements. So if you go to the next slide, you can see slightly different configuration illustrated here as an example of what one possible future outcome could be. So this view of 44th illustrates what a mixed-use infill development could look like on the left at where you can see number 3. So the 44th corridor already has a diverse mix of commercial uses, many of which are likely to evolve. Additional housing units help support more retail demand. So as properties redevelop, buildings should be positioned closer to the street where possible, kind of similar to what we talked about on Wadsworth. And then on the right, this image shows a much lower cost investment and how that might look with more temporary activation. So we have a lot of large underutilized parking lots along the corridor. So we wanted to explore some solutions to activating them, including with lower cost or temporary uses like something like a farmer's market or some kind of weekend use like that, while retaining those existing buildings and businesses at the back of the site. All right, so now we can move on to the next slide. So we show another example of that kind of low-cost activation of large parking lots or other underutilized lots along 38th Avenue shown here. So we know that repurposing older buildings and new construction are often both prohibitively costly, particularly for new or small property owners. Excuse me. So evaluating development codes to allow more flexibility both in uses and in architecture could encourage investments and new business incubation. And then for new construction, as you can see under number 2 on the right, we'd like to see designs that consolidate those taller heights near the street with buildings stepping back as they approach residential properties at the rear of the site. We have that condition in a lot of different places in Wheat Ridge. So then if we can go to the next slide, we're going to zoom into the street level still on 38th here. So this image shows a treatment for when parking lots adjacent to the sidewalk don't redevelop, like what Eric was mentioning on that toolbox discussion. So here you can see smaller investments like planter boxes or masonry walls. They can still make a big improvement on the streetscape and the experience of spending time here, even if you're not doing a wholesale redevelopment of a parking lot. And then lighting and street furniture complement those efforts. The city's already working on the 38th Avenue refresh study to address some of these pieces. And then you can see some bike parking here, which speaks to the going places, staying places conversation that we had earlier. So even though this is one of our gathering locations where we'd expect to prioritize staying places, we still want to make sure that this is a place that welcomes bicyclists through things like bike parking, wayfinding, signage, and then thoughtful connections to the surrounding network. Then we'll go on to 29th. Okay, so here's a look at 29th Avenue along the commercial segment between Fenton and Chase. So this image also illustrates that concept of building height consolidated towards the street and then stepping back to reflect the houses just behind these shallow lots. The scale of this area is smaller than along 38th to reflect the neighborhood character of this location. We also show screening and landscaping treatments, which we know are really important to the community. So things like a combination of a decorative fence or a wall with dense vegetation can provide the necessary separation between commercial areas and the adjacent residential neighborhoods. So on 29th, we're also looking at some painting and striping solutions on the street. So this is a known speeding location. So a few treatments like narrower lanes, marked on-street parking bays, and little mini medians, which you can see up in the top right corner, can provide traffic calming through here. Another challenge that arises on these really, really shallow lots in this location is getting adequate off-street parking. So sites often can't accommodate very much parking just because they're really small. However, the efficacy of on-street parking to provide traffic calming increases as parking occupancy increases. So that means that there's a potential win-win here of allowing some flexibility with that on-site parking to help make our restriping as effective as possible for slowing cars down by making sure those spaces are very well utilized. And that'll also help our businesses get more creative with how to meet requirements. Okay, finally, we can go to the last one, Ward Station. So the residential component of Ward Station Transit Village has expanded significantly over the past decade, but commercial development has remained largely absent, and we've definitely heard a lot about that, particularly from that neighborhood. So we think that the city should prioritize and incentivize commercial growth in the near future to create a more balanced and vibrant mixed-use district up there. So we see another example here of that temporary activation at number 2. So this activation could start smaller with amenities like food carts, seating areas, and other features. So this could enhance the commuter experience right away, and it could also serve as kind of a prototype for future development in the area. So this is shown here on a pedestrian plaza. So this area has been identified as one that needs outdoor gathering spaces and other public amenities. So Eric, if you could go one more slide. So we have a couple questions. We're happy to go back to any of those slides. Well, I say that because Eric's the one who has to do it now. Thank you. And yeah, so we're just curious, do you have any questions so far? And we would also love to hear your thoughts and opinions on, do these tools point us in the right directions in these areas?
Cody, what's your last name? I'm sorry.
Hedges.
Commissioner Hedges.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is that correct? Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. So first of all, I do like these a lot. I appreciate the subtle notes around how the parking is in behind the actual development, so it's street facing. I've always thought putting something between the Safeway and the actual Wadsworth, along Wadsworth, seems like a good way to actually turn that into a more vibrant area. So I think overall these are pretty good representations of what I think would be useful along these staying places ideas. I guess one question I had was at Ward Station, because I've heard that there's been difficulty about getting I think there's supposed to be a coffee shop or something or anything around that area. And you mentioned having tactics to spur commercial development there. And it seems like one of those would be temporary, food trucks, maybe farmers markets, something like that. But what other strategies do you think we could put in the plan that could be used to better encourage commercial development in that area?
That's honestly a hard question. I think that's one that I have flagged in my mind as when we get to the full draft, we need to continue noodling on that because I don't think we've quite gotten there. I don't think it's quite captured in the implementation matrix yet. I think and economic development does get out of my realm of expertise. So I will caveat this, but I would imagine that, you know, getting to that kind of incentives piece might be where we need to get. I think we can easily evaluate, are we removing barriers? But if the market isn't delivering it, that's where I think we have to get more creative and try some new tools that we haven't tried yet.
I would add, Ella, that continued pursuit of residential intensity at that site will be important to supporting any possible commercial uses. And that's one of the few places in Wheat Ridge where that's actually the plan. So that's something that ought to continue. And the more that it does, and there may be some other locations as well where additional, they would say retail follows rooftops. You may have heard that saying, where additional development of more residential units could support that down the line. But yeah, it is tricky, as Ella pointed out. There are difficulties with getting those kinds of things that those kind of neighborhood serving retail uses that everyone says they want. And so having a diverse and flexible toolkit to pursue that, in addition to the strategies that are already kind of on offer to maximize the number of housing units, those are all important pieces of it.
Commissioner Gravy.
Thank you. To what extent does the plan kind of contemplate when and how any new like parks or open space? I know that there's reference to this with regard to, you know, accommodating, you know, areas that are going to have increased interest as the staying places or the gathering places. But, you know, I think that the city's in an interesting space. You know, we're not alone, but when you look at the population of Wheat Ridge, it's been pretty steady for a fair amount of time. And, you know, there's the development of, you know, relative to its history, a tremendous amount of multifamily housing, and there will be a growth in population that is somewhat significant relative to how much has grown in the past. And, you know, because we're a small community. And I just wonder about how much thought is given and if this is, you know, the appropriate space to do so, about at what point are we, you know, building out new, you know, parks or spaces for people to be outdoors, when that's kind of one of our defining qualities as a community, and we want to maintain that reputation even with, you know, a 5% population increase, or, you know, I don't know how many more residents we're going to have with the infill development. And, you know, I think that that's a very logical place for us to be, and for a thing to encourage that type of growth, particularly with the impact on housing costs. But I just wonder about, you know, how we're balancing that and what opportunities there are to, like, and I probably have a bias because I have 2 young kids, and so I spend a lot of time at parks. But is that something that is kind of explicit in the plan?
So it will be. We have the benefit of a great proactive parks department. They're currently working on their Parks and Recreation Master Plan called Pathway. So they started a little behind us, but being more focused, that they will finish earlier. So we're planning to take go through their entire plan and figure out what needs to be specifically elevated into the city plan. The city plan will point to the Parks and Rec Master Plan Pathway, but as you noted, it's such an important part of Wheat Ridge's character that we're, even though there's another plan that will have the specific direction, we do want it to be included in the city plan. I do know that Parks does analysis, and they are tracking things like, I don't know of a good resource and how closely they're looking at like per capita park access, but I do know that spatially they're very aware of and tracking park access. Trust for Public Land has a really good tool that is actually everywhere. So, and I know that the park staff are very well plugged into that and have identified neighborhoods in Wheat Ridge that are lacking a park. That Ward Transit Station is one, and there are conversations going on for a parcel there. And it just so happens that the two closed elementary schools are both in areas that do have park needs. And since much of the recreation programming, it depends on the Color Strand fields. We aren't specifically talking about it tonight, but in your packet, you can see in that full implementation matrix, we do talk about coordinating with the Jeffco school districts to pursue a public-private partnership. We can't buy and deal with the buildings, but we want to partner with somebody who will let us retain areas for parks. So I think those are going to be the biggest opportunities in the city plan for expanding our parks. And I look forward to seeing the full pathway draft so that I can see if there are any other opportunities that we can be sure to highlight in the city plan.
A big part of our work has been, people have told us repeatedly, I think in this process and in other processes the city has done, that they love the park system in Wheat Ridge. It's fantastic. They're proud of it. They use it, and that's great. What we've heard in our process is, can we, in the mobility network conversation, connectivity and access, can you get me there? You know, is there a better way for me to get there on a bike or on foot? So that's a big part of what we're focusing on for sure.
And Eric, one other thing I'll add, also in the focus areas, one of the things we tried to do also is bring in some of those public spaces. Maybe they're not necessarily dedicated park space, but they would be kind of public space or semi-public spaces. Certainly as part of, you know, transit-oriented development along Clear Creek, we would hope that certainly in the way we'll write it in the plan is that, you know, parks and open space and gathering areas should be also included, you know, along the creek as a kind of that transition from the creek and the trail to transit-oriented or the trail-oriented development adjacent to it. And then also, that was one of the driving forces behind the illustration for Ward Station, is to actually include some green and open space or a small park that's kind of lacking in that area now. So we wanted to make sure that got in there.
I have a question. On page 24, the illustration for 29th. So the on-street parking, the striping for traffic calming is pretty easy to implement. But the illustration shows those buildings closer to the street. And in the current configuration, they're not like that. So are we to assume that that will be redeveloped? Or is that just a concept?
It's an illustration that shows if it were to redevelop, this is what to work towards. So the city plan won't be like calling specific parcels or anything like that. This is really kind of a visioning exercise of if somebody came in and said, hey, I want to do XYZ and, you know, this building is condemned, so I need to take it down. And they, you know, came in with a terrible design or said, what kind of thing would the city support here? This is where we want to show, like, if you are going to redevelop, this is what we're looking at. We know that there are a lot of areas that aren't going to see that, and that's why we wanted to show some of those kind of lower cost solutions. This is just such a smaller scope, so we didn't have that on here, but that's why we have on 44th and 38th those kind of temporary activation, because yeah, we understand this is at the far end of that 15-year kind of idea, and there are a lot of likely outcomes in that area that aren't to this extreme.
Thank you.
Can I add, Ella, that one of the things we liked about this approach is that yes, or no, they're not development proposals, but rather by illustrating them in this way, it allows us to think through. So we have these tools. We talked about the 4 categories of tools. And so number one, what do they look like in practice? So take them from these vague abstract descriptions to application. Okay, this is what it means. This particular staying place tool, when we use it, it kind of could look like this, or it could look like that. So across these 9 images, that gives us a chance to do that. So there's some educational value. The other is to say, okay, on the assumption that we like these 9 images that we put together, we'll see what kind of feedback we get through this phase of engagement. But if we like those visions, then what does it mean for the way that we need to refine our tools in the future? Do we have all the tools in the toolbox that we need? Are we using the tools the way that these images would suggest that we should? If we don't have the tools, what tools do we need to develop? Do we have, for example, do we have the right requirements for screening and landscaping, or do we not? Is that something that that we've got to create and put in our code? So it gives us something, kind of a set of guideposts to shoot for as we move forward.
Thank you. Commissioner Quinones.
Actually, I have a couple questions, but the first question, I'm a little curious, is how do you prioritize which project you're going to focus on first?
So the focus areas aren't like projects that we would be leading or doing. The plan overall will be prioritizing by, we talked about in phase 2, I believe, those, we brought 4 priorities forward, and the community and you all talked about those. So that will be one kind of set of priorities. Then what we'll talk about is the implementation matrix and kind of what to expect with the big moving pieces there. So I think the focus areas are a good illustration of tools and different ways to solve problems and evaluate our tool sets. If you're thinking about like, what's the city doing next after this is adopted, the combination of those priorities and then the implementation, I think would be where you would want to look.
Yeah, I was mostly thinking about what are you taking in consideration as you go to prioritize, but maybe it's a little bit more complex of a question than something you can answer right now.
Well, I think, could we circle back to that when we talk about implementation? Because I think that's the context where, as we kind of filtered everything we've heard so far into like what has to happen first, like the right kind of sequencing, considering funding, staffing, staff capacity, I was surprised how much it filtered itself out into like, this is kind of what you need to do next.
Okay. My next question, out of curiosity, as we're talking about the going places, I guess going places or staying places, and adding those setbacks and adding the sidewalks for people to move, are those sidewalks maintained by the city once they're put in place? So, like, for example, everything that's happening on Wadsworth and 38th, is the city technically going to continue to maintain that area, or does that eventually go to CDOT? Like, I don't know who actually owns that responsibility.
That's a great question. At this point, I'm going to say it is a CDOT roadway. And so the control is through CDOT. I would actually have to ask our Public Works to get a specific answer on that question for long-term maintenance. That's a great question. But typically on roadways, yeah, the city would, other than CDOT roadways, the city would own and maintain. And that's why we do the whole development agreements and ensuring we have the escrowed funds or the letter of credit to ensure that they get built the way they're supposed to get built. And then for I believe it's 2 years after, there's a warranty period that it enters into to make sure that like the concrete held up and things like that. And then during that 2-year warranty period, the developer would be, or whoever they contracted with would have to replace it if there was a serious problem with it. So, but on CDOT rights of way, I don't know about the long-term maintenance. We'll find out though. It's a great question. Commissioner Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question on page 18, it says refinement of tools will have implications for regulatory codes. And I think I'm just trying to connect in my head where we see the tools being applied, like the same tool being theoretically applied in multiple focus areas. Does that mean that the code will be the same for each of those, like straight across? And it will be like, for example, take the bulk plane on 29th and the bulk plane on Wads Shopping Center. So that will all be the same regulatory code, just applied in different areas.
It would be coming from the same code. There might be different contexts that we realize that the requirements need to be different though. So that's where when we do kind of a deeper dive on the code, we want to make sure we're getting that nuance right. It wouldn't be, this is the 29th setbacks, but it would be, this is the appropriate regulations for this kind of context.
For that
Yeah.
specific type. Okay. And then, so for example, also like on 29th, new development going in now, that is not on the sidewalk. That is, I guess, I'm just trying to figure out how that development that is going to complete, in the next year it won't have to conform to any of this because the code isn't updated yet.
Yeah, so this would be policy direction. They would still be needing to be compliant with the existing code. So if we change the code in the future, buildings after that point would have to respond to it, but none of the requirements will be changed automatically with the adoption of this.
Gotcha. Okay. Just one other comment on 29th. I think this is meant to be an example. I, first of all, think it's great, but one thought in my mind is I don't see any of the going places tools on this example. And because that is now connecting 29th to the new bike lane from Sheridan to downtown, it might be a good opportunity to also add a going place tool there.
So that has come up a lot, especially with the very high visibility improvements in Denver. And again, this is definitely in Public Works realm. My understanding of those conversations, though, is that there isn't actually room there for a bike lane, at least certainly not one like that. The right of way on 29th in Denver is much, much wider.
Right.
This is one of those areas where if we can't accommodate a bike lane through there, we want to be very thoughtful with wayfinding and connecting those riders around other parts of the network that can better accommodate them. Part of the traffic calming on that is that for more comfortable riders, we'd want it to be slow enough that they would be comfortable riding there. But I mean, as I can agree with Dan with two small kids, it'll be a long time before I will be riding in traffic with my kids. So we want to make sure that we're figuring that out from a network perspective for all riders. So that one has come up a lot. And for those wanting it to extend, I do want to manage expectations that our right of way is just much, much smaller there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I see that. I just, it's not Sheridan's not a good connector up to 32nd. So,
Yes.
And I live on Ames and it's a giant hill. So nobody wants to ride up that.
Yes, no, that is one of the things on my
Yeah.
list for the full mobility network, to make sure, particularly from that connection, that we're finding a way and then signing it really clearly for folks to get back onto safe routes.
Excellent. Thank you.
Commissioner Hedges.
Thank you. So since the zoning code got brought up, is there plans to have a zoning code update following the comprehensive plan or otherwise?
Can I defer that question until we talk about the implementation, because we are going to touch on that. Thank you.
All right, moving along.
All right, let's continue on. Thank you, Eric, for continuing to do the slides for me. So we're going to talk about implementation. So the city plan will include a section of what to expect for implementation of the plan after it's adopted. So you can see from this graphic, which you're not intended to be able to read. So if you're worrying about your eyesight, don't worry. This is just to illustrate kind of the layout and organization of it. We've organized the high-level next steps to implement the city plan by key principles and priorities that are detailed in the plan. So one thing to note, this is not an exhaustive work plan. Instead, this is the high-level next steps to implement the priorities in this plan. So it includes both short-term actions as well as more ambitious and long-term actions organized into near-term, mid-term, and long-term. Some of these actions are not funded, and they will therefore require future community conversations about if and how we fund them. We expect to have more content in the draft plan to provide more information on each of these, but this will just give you an overview of kind of what we're thinking about at this point. So next slide. So let's see. All of these strategies are included in the version that you can read in attachment 4, but we're going to focus on several of these that are highlighted here. Thank you. That will involve a role for Planning Commission in the future to help make any changes to the regulatory codes. So tonight I'm going to focus on a few implementation steps that we would be working closely with this group to implement. Next slide. So under the category of improved retail and business environment and that kind of 38th Avenue Main Street, we have these implementation actions identified. So I'm going to focus on the highlighted ones that we'll be working with you on closely. So we know we want to support lower cost of entry for new businesses, including the spaces where they operate. So we want to evaluate our zoning code and revise it as appropriate to remove some barriers to temporary and short-term commercial development. So that is one that we would be looking at the zoning code. Then if you go to the next slide, under the planning principle of managing new development to preserve our patchwork quilt, we have a couple items to highlight. So as we work on the set of tools that we presented earlier tonight, we know that our regulatory codes will need some tweaks to implement some of the tools in ways that achieves peaceful coexistence. So we want to first take kind of a quick pass at those codes to evaluate those quick wins, the low-hanging fruit, and see what we can implement quickly in the near term. Also in the near term, we'll want to do a deeper dive to see what needs to happen to kind of fully implement the broader goals of this plan. So based on that, what that first analysis finds, we'll plan to make those bigger updates in that midterm range. So yeah, again, we'd be working with Planning Commission on each of those pieces. So those are the real ones we want to hone in on tonight. So I'm just curious if, Eric, you could go back to the question. Thank you. So are there critical tools missing from this discussion so far? Looking ahead to possible future code changes, do you have any questions or concerns, or just other questions or thoughts about what we just covered? I know we had some earlier questions kind of adjacent to this stuff, so let me know if you want to, if you have more specific follow-ups now.
Commissioner Quinn.
And maybe this is a wrong assumption, that these would be more focused on like the multi-use type of districts that we would be changing the codes to, that would have, looking at the examples, it looks to me that that would have more of an effect on that. So we would be seeing the codes changed for the multi-use whatever zoning district to put in more pedestrian lighting or whatever. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think a lot of this would happen in kind of our mixed use or commercial stuff, both for what happens in those places as well as how those places interact with nearby residential. One of the reasons this whole conversation came up is just understanding that we've heard a lot that people want their neighborhood commercial. They want a corner, be able to go to something on their corner. But then what our commercial zone districts allow is often too intense to be right in those kind of neighborhoods. So yes, I do think that a lot of these tweaks would be on commercial mixed use types of uses.
Yeah, because I think that might be some of the issue with the ward area, that transit-oriented area, maybe lessen some restrictions or something that maybe is keeping the little coffee shop from coming in. But I think it's a lot of it's we just need the people to be there to kind of drive that as well. And then how about, because I live on 38th, from Kipling to Youngfield, I'm going to assume that's going to be one of the tools that will drive or be implemented when we redevelop that and have our going places idea going through there.
So for the west end of 38th, if, let's see, let me look at on the bigger implementation matrix, we do list several, there are a lot of projects going on within Public Works that very closely align to this. And so the way I've printed it is comically tiny and I can't read it, but the west end 38th is kind of its own project, but you'll see it pop up in here because it's so relevant to what we're talking about here.
Commissioner Hollop?
Thank you. I have a pretty good sense of how these tools apply to some of the key planning principles and priorities, but the one I'm not so clear on is the proactive infrastructure management. And just wondering if you can share, I know these were just examples of the tools, but if there are others that are in here already that would fulfill that, or maybe ones that aren't listed here that can just give us a better picture of what that would look like.
You're accurately identifying that they're not really in there. I definitely want to hear Eric's thoughts on this following up. But the tools are really the going and staying, not entirely, but the rest of them are largely focused on what happens on private property. And they are meant to put up the right guardrails so that private investment yields the right outcomes that the community wants. For the whole category of proactive infrastructure management, that's basically all public. Like there's nothing in that proactive management is the part that the city and in some cases, special districts and state needs to do. So I think that the toolbox itself isn't the lens through which we'll address that priority. That one is going to be more kind of the big looking for capital improvement planning funding and kind of like the ongoing stream for that and how the city needs to get its ducks in a row to address that. So I think that will be more in other chapters and section. There's actually going to be a whole priorities section that gives the background and next steps for each of those.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Hedges?
Thank you again, Madam Chair. I've been trying to figure out how to ask this question. I haven't got a good way yet, so I'm just going to kind of say it as it's in my head. I'm thinking about exactly what Commissioner Hollop just said, and it's around how I know City Council is having having a session on priority corridors for pedestrian access sometime, I think, coming up. And I don't know when they mentioned it to me. And so I was wondering, I don't know how exactly the interplay between the Planning Commission and the council when we're talking about relatively the same thing, but in like different lanes, how that interaction works. And so I don't know exactly what question I'm asking, but like how is it that we can work together to make sure that what's being prioritized in this plan in terms of those programs and implementing those programs are also reflected and like coordinated with council's prioritization corridors that they're talking about in the coming, months, we'll say.
That's a loaded question, but I think I understand what you're asking is like, basically what is Planning Commission's role in this? Planning Commission reviews private development, but the key piece of that is how the public-private interface works. And one of the things that we go through months and months of review, Public Works is one of our reviewer departments, and of course, engineering. And so staff is carefully looking at these pieces as it moves through. As far as Planning Commission's specific role with regard to public infrastructure, it's a little less, I guess your role isn't as much so because it doesn't fall into, we're looking for funding or we're
prioritizing corridors or something like that. But you are very important in that those private developments that come in, we need to make sure that they are also meeting the same standards that, for instance, if our Public Works Department has a priority project and they're maybe getting some funding for it, or maybe it's 2J funds or something, that the private development piece is meshing with that properly. And so the piece, though, that is important is your role in the city plan, in that getting these the place types and the tools and everything like that right, so that you've got, staff has and you have the proper tool to rely on for guidance, is also a critical piece of this. And one of the things that the city plan can do in conjunction with other departments' plans is to help guide funding, because a lot of times when you're asking for funding, they want to know, where does it stand in your priorities, and, you know, what document can it be found in, and things like that. So that's kind of your role, I would say, in this, in a bigger picture. And then, of course, as Wheat Ridge residents, you can certainly attend council meetings and have your voice heard. So just not as a planning commissioner, you would be wearing your resident hat at that point. But did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I was just kind of, it's day one, so I'm like,
No, it's a
where is
great
this
question.
line? So yeah, that was
Yeah.
it. Yeah, it works. It's good. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, sure. And we can always chat more anytime.
Please continue.
That was the end of our presentation and discussion. So if there are no more questions, we'll just wrap up with our next steps. And I do need to be able to see those. Okay, so, thank you. We're piecing this together technologically. Well, I am. You guys are doing great. So we still have, this is our last event of our Phase 4 engagement. We still do have our What's Up Wheat Ridge survey open. It will be open for another couple weeks. So that's up until March 21st at 5 p.m. Please do help us spread the word. At this point in the process, we're in the weeds. So it is a more involved survey. At the beginning, you get to ask like your vision and your feelings and your thoughts. At this point, we've got some meaty stuff to react to. So it is a longer survey, but we'd love to get, your community members with attention to detail and in the weeds to take a look at it. If you have any other thoughts from that you think of after tonight, a lot of that same content is online. You're welcome to add additional input through the survey, or of course you can always reach out directly to me. And the next time we'll all be together, we will have that draft plan. So we're going to be taking all of this input back from Phase 4 and integrating it into a draft. We'll first do an internal review draft for staff. To make sure we're not making any promises that aren't feasible or anything like that. But then we'll plan to release that draft public review in the late spring, kind of early summer. We'll have, once I have a better sense of when that will be, we'll schedule another study session to come talk with you, and then there'll be no more unknowns. We'll have the whole plan in hand and can really get into any of the specific details that are interesting to this group. And then we'll aim to have our formal adoption over the summer. And I believe that is it. So if you could go to the next slide, I think it's just a thank you. Yep. That is all. Thank you so much for your time. Great thoughts and discussion. We always really appreciate your input. And we're excited to have you see it reflected in a draft plan in a few months. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great. I failed to have the general interest public forum. We don't have anybody in the audience. We have no one signed up on Zoom. Okay, so the next item on the agenda, I'm also going to table because I've declared that I am the queen of the Planning Commission, so we're not going to have a vote for officers tonight. I'm going to remain in office for one more year. All right, so, no, I'm kidding. So old business is the next item on the agenda. Do we have any old business?
We do not have any old business. Would you like me to move into new business? I'd like to welcome Cody Hedges, our new planning commissioner. And I would also like to welcome Susan Wood, who will join us next time, whenever our next meeting is. I don't have any upcoming dates at this moment that have anything scheduled on them, so, but keep an eye out for an email from Tammy and let us know if you can attend at the next meeting. I don't know if, Cody, if you want to give any background or any, I kind of putting you on the spot, but you know what you do, so.
Yeah, do you mean what do I do for a living and
Yeah,
stuff
just
like
a-
that?
Just a little background.
Oh, yeah. So I'm a transportation planner. I do passenger rail. So if you're curious about that, and other random transit is my background. And so I work for CDOT, which is, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And been here for going on 5 years now. I'm in District 1 because I know we don't have any signs for that, but that's where I live nowadays. I moved here from SF, but I'm from Indiana, so I will call myself a Hoosier a lot and randomly, and it will make no sense unless you know that that means I'm from Indiana. So that's what that means, and that's what it translates to. And during basketball season, I can be obnoxious, so that's okay. Otherwise, yeah, that's the introduction of me. I think so. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you. It's always good to know everyone's background, and then you can rely on people for specific specialty knowledge that they may have. So thanks very much for that. Let's see here. I also don't have any project or development updates, but we do need to do an election of chair and vice chair. So with that, we will get, this is by secret ballot. So what you do is you fill out on a piece of paper. First, we'll go with chair. And as a reminder, although the queen is reigning over tonight, we need to elect somebody else as the chair, and then somebody other than Commissioner Quinn as vice chair. They can reverse roles, but you're also more than welcome to elect someone new. So we're going to start off with writing down your pick for the chair, and then you'll just pass those down to Tammy.
Jana, can you remind me what's the term length for these leadership?
1 year.
That's what I thought.
Yep.
I can't, no.
Okay, so our new chair is Mr. Quinn.
Congratulations. All right, next we will do the same thing for vice chair.
And our new vice chair is Miss Disney.
All right, good job. All right, and now we can move into your commissioner updates. I don't have any other updates.
Any commissioner updates? Commissioner Gravy?
I don't have any updates, but I will just mention quickly, if you didn't see, there was a fun article in the Denver Post today about the Clear Creek Crossing restaurant retail developments that we reviewed, talking about the Prost and, the hashtag and, they talked about the Evergreen folks were quoted in there. And so it was a trip down memory lane from some of our past meetings, but it was fun to see it highlighted in the Post. So I just thought I'd mention it.
I have an update. The Cultural Commission is having a fundraiser Friday night, tomorrow night. They'll be selling art that was once housed at Lutheran Hospital. So it's going to be up in the Methodist Church at I guess it's called the Cultural Center now. They have a gymnasium in that church. It's on 38th there, just east of Wadsworth, the Methodist Church. And it's going to be in the gymnasium, and it starts at 5. So please try to attend. Because there's going to be, it's mostly photography from what I hear, but it's a great opportunity if you're trying to get art in an office or if you need something for your home. And it's a fundraiser for the Cultural Commission's grant program. So that's a great opportunity for artists in Wheat Ridge to be able to have workshops. There's going to be a gentleman that did receive a grant performing music. So it'll be a fun time. There'll be hors d'oeuvres and wine, and love to see you there. It starts at 5 tomorrow on the 7th. All right. If there's no more updates, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Madam Queen.
And any seconds?
Second.
Commissioners, please vote.
Motion approved, 7-0.